Who are some famous Spanish people? It's a good question. Back during the Great Recession of 2009 to 2017, approximately, a lot of people were talking about Spain's failure to market itself internationally. And one of the topics that often came up is that a lot of people in the US probably don't know much about famous Spanish people. The Spaniards they certainly do know about are probably free-floating in most people's minds within some sort of ambiguous Mexican/Puerto Rican/general Hispanic category. The fact that New Yorkers have spent the past century or so using Spanish to refer to anyone but people from Spain over in Europe doesn't help. So that's the question we're going to talk about today. Who are the most famous Spanish people? Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 112, all about famous Spanish people. We're going to do living people today because, there are plenty of historical figures who would also be interesting to talk about, but better for another time. Today, we've got athletes, we've got musicians, we've got actors, we've got an adult film star, and occasional shaman who I almost saw naked one time. It's a story I'll tell you in a little bit. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this episode. You can donate to the podcast at expatmadrid.com/donate. Just go over to expatmadrid.com/donate and send your contribution to this project. I appreciate it. You can send anything from €3 to however much you're comfortable with, and everything helps. I'm making a new episode every week these days. It's kind of a lot of work, but I'm able to manage it with all the other things I do. So, expatmadrid.com/donate for your support. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the famous Spanish people, starting with Antonio Banderas. Probably the most famous Spanish person these days is Antonio Banderas. He's seemingly been around Hollywood forever, but actually he got his start in Spanish cinema. Way back in the 80s, he was in several films directed by Pedro Almodóvar, who we will be hearing about in a moment. As such, he was part of the Movida Madrileña, which was apparently a lot of fun if you were around for it. The dictatorship was over, and there was a sort of artistic revival with lots of sex and drugs and wild self-expression. Unfortunately, a lot of the people involved in La Movida OD'd or died of AIDS and are not around anymore. But Banderas survived, and eventually he became Zorro, as well as El Mariachi from those Robert Rodriguez shoot-'em-ups. He's also continued collaborating off and on with Pedro Almodóvar. I talked about a couple of Almodóvar-Banderas masterpieces in my article American Ignorance. That's episode 44 of the podcast, if you would like to listen to it. Also in episode 70, I talked about how Banderas is sometimes given awards in Hollywood for people of color. I talked about how nobody was thinking about Spain over here in Europe when they made up these racial categories, so Antonio Banderas from Malaga occasionally just gets thrown into the Latin or general Hispanic category and receives awards for people of color in Hollywood. Spanish people think this is ridiculous, but there's not much to be done. The US has its categories, and that's part of the reason why we're talking about famous Spanish people today. Let's move on to Pedro Almodóvar, a film director. Pedro Almodóvar himself is very famous in Spain, but perhaps not a household name in the US. Maybe he's art house famous, though. I wouldn't really know. Anyway, he won an Academy Award and a Golden Globe for Talk to Her, which was actually pretty good. A lot of his more recent films, in my humble opinion, kind of suck. And a lot of Spaniards don't like him for making them look like a nation of eccentrics and perverts. Spanish people want, above all else, to be considered normal, so they don't appreciate their most famous film director making them look otherwise. For an easy intro to Almodóvar, check out Talk to Her or Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. That's one of the older ones. It's a lot of fun, but very weird. Moving on, let's talk about Penélope Cruz and Javier Bardem. Also actors, Penélope Cruz is from Alcobendas in the Comunidad de Madrid, and Javier Bardem is from Las Palmas. de Gran Canaria, a very nice place that you should visit if you can. These two are also Spanish and have also made it big in Hollywood. If you want to have some fun with Spanish stereotypes, you should see a movie called Jamón Jamón, Ham, Ham. The film is like a compendium of all the ridiculously Spanish things you could imagine. There's an obsession with pork products, bulls and bullfighting, testicles and general male virility, prostitution, breasts, etc. It's quite a feast for the senses. Penelope Cruz and Javier Bardem actually met during the filming of this movie a full 15 years before Woody Allen cast them together in Vicky Cristina Barcelona. Now, apparently, Javier Bardem and Penelope Cruz are married, so I guess they're a Spanish Hollywood power couple. I used to give English classes in Alcobendas back in the day, and I never ran into Penelope Cruz. I've also been to Las Palmas a few times and haven't seen Javier Bardem at the municipal market, but they are both fully Spanish. Let's talk about Rafa Nadal, the tennis player. Spain has some pretty good athletes. See, for example, Rafael Nadal from Mallorca in the Balearic Islands, the Islas Baleares. I'm not really certain how we're supposed to pronounce this in English. Anyway, he's considered to be one of the best tennis players of all time. In a previous version of this article, a much younger me said that Nadal was great at hitting a little green ball over a net. But in my mind, tennis doesn't really qualify as a sport. That's exactly the kind of thing younger me said a lot, and I was probably wrong. But as a guy who grew up in Arizona, I always took tennis to be a hobby for obnoxious rich people. It wasn't a sport that regular people could just play. Tennis courts were somewhat rare out in the desert, I guess, and probably only existed at the kind of resorts I might have become a bellboy at if things in my life had gone a little bit differently. Anyway, I've gained little to no appreciation for tennis throughout the years. Sorry, Rafa Nadal. These days, an up-and-coming tennis talent is Carlos Alcaraz from Murcia. At just 23 years old at the time of this writing, he's ranked number 2 in the world. He's been winning major tournaments since age 19. I guess we'll be hearing more from him in the future. Speaking of sports that I don't really appreciate, Fernando Alonso from Oviedo, Asturias, is pretty good at driving wildly expensive cars around in circles. They call it Formula One, and I used to have a flatmate who watched it on weekends. I could never get into it, but I guess it's popular. Apparently, Alonso is still active in Formula One, driving for the Aston Martin racing team. I think in the US, NASCAR is probably more popular than Formula One. All I know is that we have the Indianapolis 500, but I never would have watched an event like that on TV. Back in high school, our library had an Indy 500 racing game on one of those big boxy computers. That was a lot of fun, but I wouldn't say it got me into car racing any more than the Oregon Trail game got me into wagon trekking. Although you should totally read a book called The Oregon Trail by Rinker Buck. It's very good, even if you're not a wagon aficionado. Let's talk about some other Spanish athletes. We have an honorable mention category here. The Spanish national football team won a World Cup back in 2010, and around Spain, some of those players were household names for a while. For example, thousands of Spanish boys born at that time are named Iker, after Iker Casillas, a charming and talented goalie for the national team and for Real Madrid. And football is very international, of course, but it's not big in the US, and I doubt that most Americans remember players like Carlos Puyol from the 2010 team. Gerard Piqué, or Piqué possibly, was somewhat famous for his marriage to tax evader and occasional pop star Shakira. She is from Colombia, but has had Spanish nationality since 2015. She now lives in Miami and complains about the Spanish tax authorities being unfair to her. I don't know. It would appear that the most famous football players here in Spain are not actually Spanish. Messi, who I have no idea if he's still playing, but Messi, kind of a big deal. He's from Argentina. Right on the corner outside my house here, there is an Argentinian bakery, and they have a big cardboard cutout of Messi in their window. Cristiano Ronaldo, not Spanish. He's from Portugal, but played for, one of these teams. I'm not a big fan of spectator sports, in case you can't tell, so it's hard for me to talk intelligently about football. In the future, keep an eye out for a guy called Lamine Yamal, who plays for Barca. Born in 2007 to parents from Morocco and Equatorial Guinea, he's Barcelona's new star football player. I read an article the other day that people were contemplating how this redefined what it means to be Catalan, because he grew up just up the coast in Mataró and he's fully Catalan, except that he's, not ethnically Catalan. So it's a whole new thing moving forward. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about as a new generation of Spanish people grows up that looks nothing like the older generations of Spanish people. Spain also spent several years producing some pretty good basketball players. Some went to play in the NBA, specifically Pau Gasol, Marc Gasol, and Ricky Rubio, all from here in Catalonia, as well as some others. Some Spaniards suspected years ago that the superlative awesomeness of our national sports was actually a conspiracy by the government to take people's minds off the shittiness of the economy and the many corruption scandals. That is an interesting theory, to be sure, but given that the tendency of the Spanish government is to make things worse and not better, I don't see how they could suddenly become amazing at producing talented athletes. Anyway, let's move on here. Next up, we've got Julio and Enrique Iglesias, two singers. Julio and Enrique Iglesias, both born in Madrid, are of course very popular singers. Julio is the father, Enrique is the son, and Spanish people don't get much more famous than this. Anyway, something you might not know. Enrique Iglesias has spent most of his life in the US, being sent there after his grandfather, the eminent gynecologist Julio Iglesias Puga, was kidnapped by Basque nationalists back in 1981. I guess it's a long story and I don't know much about it, but the whole Iglesias family has been kind of pissed off at Spain since then. Incidentally, I don't think I had listened to a single Julio Iglesias song until very recently, but it's about what you would expect a guy in a white suit from the 1970s to sound like. Enrique Iglesias is a good example of what I mean when I say that a lot of Americans might have a mental category for general Hispanic. Spanish-speaking musicians sometimes seem to be considered as one category or genre, regardless of where they're from. So to me, looking at pop music around the year 2000, there was no obvious difference between Jennifer Lopez, Ricky Martin, Enrique Iglesias, Gloria Estefan, etc. They were all just Latin music, or something similar. In the video for Enrique's 1998 song Bailamos, there's nothing specifically Spanish going on. It's a nightclub video. It's about dancing. And in the video for his 2014 mega hit Bailando, which is similarly themed, completely different, Bailamos and Bailando, but they're both songs about dancing. That video was filmed in the Dominican Republic and in Cuba. It looks like they're kind of trying to do a Bollywood-style video, but full of Latin people. In other words, it's international Latin, Miami-based Latin, nothing to do with the Iglesias family's roots in Madrid or Galicia. Julio Iglesias actually has some songs that he sings in Gallego. He's allegedly sung in many different languages. I heard him yesterday singing in Gallego and also in German, but he's also done French and Italian, among others. Apparently, the Latin Grammys includes Spanish artists, and Julio Iglesias, the singer, not the gynecologist, has been inducted into the Latin Songwriters Hall of Fame. Once again, what does Latin mean? I talk a little bit more about why we say Latin for things that are not canonically Latin in my article called America, a Country and a Continent. That is here on the podcast in episode 98, if you would like to take a look at that. Let's move on, though. Let's talk about Rosalía. Another artist I had never actually heard before this morning is Rosalía. I know about her, of course. I've seen pictures. She is the Motomami, the most famous Catalan person in history. She's also the youngest person on this list, born in 1992. I wrote about famous Catalans in my Seven Hills article. That is episode 88 if you would like to listen to it. And I'm really not joking when I say that Rosalia is the most famous Catalan in history. It's at least between her and Salvador Dali, and Dali did not have any songs with over 1 billion listens on Spotify. Rosalia has 2. Apparently, the Motomami's first album was a collection of old flamenco songs called Los Angeles. I think she's referring to supernatural angels there and not the city in California. It is shockingly good. It made my hair stand on end when I listened to it yesterday. Have a listen on your favorite streaming service. It's on Spotify, probably on YouTube also. I loved it, and I don't usually get into flamenco music all that much. Her later songs are in some genre I don't understand, but I'm pretty sure Despecha is good as well. She doesn't tend to pronounce whole words when she's singing, and so the lyrics are a bit hard to interpret, but very good stuff. I am actually quite surprised. I was ready to write Rosalia off as just another, mediocre pop starlet whose main talent was making videos that look like softcore pornography. And she actually does have quite a few videos that look like softcore pornography. But I've also become convinced that she is a musical genius. So life is surprising. I guess she's the most famous Catalan person for a reason. Speaking of pornography, we've got honorable mention for a few other Spanish musicians, and then we're moving on to the time I almost shared a shower with a Spanish porn star. So, honorable mention goes to Los del Rio from Sevilla, who wrote the Macarena back in the day. You remember the Macarena? How a couple of old Sevillano guys had a global hit in the 90s is a story best told by Rob Harvilla over 60 songs that explain the 90s. That is one of my all-time favorite podcasts. If you haven't heard it, just pick a episode that sounds interesting to you and go from there. Anyway, his episode about the Macarena is quite interesting. Also from Spain, the opera singer, composer, and orchestra director Plácido Domingo from Madrid is well known as one of the 3 tenors. The other 2 are, of course, Luciano Pavarotti, who died in 2007, and José Carreras from Barcelona, who, as the Seinfeld episode made clear, nobody can ever remember. In general, though, I find it hard to get into Spanish music. They have a couple of hard rock acts from the 80s, a ton of flamenco pop, and now a number of hip-hop or rap acts, but I can't say that I listen to most of it regularly. Perhaps Rosalia will be entering my rotation here, but generally I listen to American music here at home. Okay, you've been waiting for this moment. Let's talk about Nacho Vidal, the porn star. I am not sure how famous Nacho Vidal, the adult film star, is outside of his little niche, but he is the Spanish celebrity who I've come closest to sharing a shower with. Here's the story. Back when I was an amateur boxer in my Madrid days, I showed up at the gym for my usual class, only to find the place overrun by a bunch of showbiz types. It was clear that they were showbiz types because nobody else at my gym would ever show up with fancy hairstyles and gold Adidas tracksuits. Anyway, they were doing a boxing-themed photo shoot. Later on, someone told me that it was Rolling Stone, well, Spanish Rolling Stone anyway, doing a piece on Nacho Vidal. I pretended to know who they were talking about and Googled him when I got home. I guess I had been just centimeters away from his famous wang in the locker room without even knowing it. It's a pity. I can't find that Rolling Stones article online, but elsewhere in the magazine, I've seen that Vidal is referred to as a penis-shaped candle entrepreneur. If I were writing that piece, I would have added an extra hyphen to penis-shaped candle to make it clear that it's the candle and not the entrepreneur that is penis-shaped, but that's just me. That article and others report that Vidal was arrested in June 2020 and charged with manslaughter after someone died at a ritual in which Vidal allegedly had them smoke toad venom. Vidal's lawyer denies that his client is any sort of shaman, and it looks like the case is still going through the courts. In the interest of gender equality here, I should probably mention Rebecca Linares from San Sebastian up in the Basque Country. She is also an adult film star, and I believe you could probably see her and Nacho Vidal sharing a screen in various positions if you wanted to Google it. That wraps up our episode on famous Spanish people. Like I said, there is a whole category of historical Spaniards who would be worth talking about. Miguel de Cervantes I talked about quite a bit in my Root of Don Quixote episode. He was the author of Don Quixote. Pablo Picasso was also from Malaga, just like Antonio Banderas. I don't think that I realized Picasso was Spanish for the first couple of decades of my life. I think I just assumed that he was French because he spent a lot of time in France, and also because I just sort of assumed that artists were French. We didn't have the world's best art history program at my middle school out in the Arizona desert, so I just did not get a lot of Picasso. There are also a couple of other living Spaniards who didn't make this article. I'm wondering if I've got enough that I could write about Amancio Ortega, the founder of Zara and the Inditex empire. And there's also Ana Patricia Botín, the current president of Banco Santander, or the Santander Banking Group. The Botín family is from Santander, a city in the north of Spain. A lot of people have heard of Banco Santander and have no idea that it is associated with a city in the north of Spain. It's actually a very nice place, and the Botín family has, a presence there. They recently built this large art center right in the port. Across the bay from the city of Santander, there is a data center now from the bank, which is, just an underground data center out in the countryside. I actually wrote the first version of this article 13 years ago, and I promised to follow up about Amancio Ortega and Ana Patricia Botín back then. So that was 13 years ago. Maybe these days my time management has improved and I will be better able to make that happen. However, no promises. That's about all I've got for today. Remember, if a porn star turned shaman asks you to smoke some toad venom, just say no. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can support this podcast by going to expatmadrid.com/donate. That's just a page where you can donate some money. I think you can use Google Pay, but also a credit or debit card, your PayPal account, whatever you want, expatmadrid.com/donate. I appreciate it. You can write me a message there telling me about what you would like to hear on a future episode of the podcast. I've got a few more things I would like to talk about here. Tourist season is coming up. I have talked quite a bit about Bike Tour in Spain, biketourinspain.com with my homeboy Raul over there. Raul will set you up with a bike tour in some very interesting parts of Spain. I've done 2 tours with him so far. The Root of Don Quixote, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, that is episode 76 of the podcast, if you'd like a full accounting of that. Also, his Extremadura bike tour, which is episode 94, was one of the best Spanish experiences I have had in literally 20 years in Spain. Go over to biketourinspain.com for more information about that. He's got a few other areas as well. La Rioja, if you're into the whole wine thing. He does Madrid, Valencia, and I believe at this point Raul is out on his bicycle looking for new routes to add for future cycling seasons. So, biketourinspain.com for all your bike touring needs. They're very well organized, and you stay in some very nice places as well. I would also like to mention a couple of other touristy things you can do if you're visiting Spain anytime soon. Devour Tours organizes food tours in Europe and also in the US. Here in Spain, they're in many different locations. You can take a look at expatmadrid.com/devour. That's an affiliate link. It'll take you right to their tours site. And actually, here in Spain, they have Barcelona, Madrid, San Sebastian, and Sevilla. If you're in one of those cities and you want to try a food tour, well worth your time. I went on one in Madrid way back in the day and I enjoyed it a lot. They've also got 5 cities in Italy. Just go to expatmadrid.com/devour and you'll get all the information. Like I said, that's an affiliate link if you sign up for a tour there after clicking on that link or after typing that link into your browser. I will get a little bit of a commission. expatmadrid.com/devour, DEVOUR. Similarly, the sister company to Devour Tours is Walks. You can go to expatmadrid.com/walks. They do quite a bit of stuff also. I went on their early morning tour of the Prado Museum last year. That was an incredible experience because you get to be in the Prado for about an hour before anybody else shows up. It's a small group tour, so we were with a tour guide and 4 or 5 other people. It was very different than your usual Prado Museum experience. Go to expatmadrid.com/walks for that. They have sort of premium walking tours all over Europe as well. Italy, Spain, France, the UK, the Netherlands, Portugal. Take a look if you're going to be in any of those destinations. Here in Barcelona, I think they do a couple of the buildings from Gaudí. At least they do the Sagrada Familia. So check that out, expatmadrid.com/walks. There's a silent L in walks, of course, WALKS. We're not talking about the Asian cuisine. I've got a channel on YouTube. Go over to YouTube and look for Learn Spanish with Daniel. I have made, 50 different videos teaching different aspects of Spanish grammar and vocabulary. More over there soon. Just look for Learn Spanish with Daniel and you will find me. Nada más por hoy. If you think I've missed any important Spanish people who I should have talked about and I didn't, drop me a line wherever you find me. Thank you very much for listening once again and hasta la próxima. Bye.